Hi, everyone. Welcome. I see that people are joining in on our webinar here with the Community Foundation of the Verdugos. We just waiting for some of our presenters to show up here, and we'll be starting soon. All right, just about ready to begin here. Hi, Delynn, Jesse, Vanessa. Thank you, everyone. So welcome, everyone, to our to the Community Foundation of the Verdugos. My name is Faith Prescott. I will be moderating the event for today. And we have joined here Delynn Russell, the board president of Community Foundation of the Verdugos. Today, we will have our educational webinar, which is the importance of estate planning and a post-election market outlook. Oh, here we go. And I'll be sharing my screen here today. We have Delynn Russell. She will be our event moderator. We'll also be joined by Vanessa Terzian, adjunct professor of wills and trusts at Southwestern Law School and partner at Lagerlof. And then we'll also be joined by Jesse McCombs, vice president, senior portfolio manager at Northern Trust. I just wanted to let everyone know here that this presentation does not constitute tax, financial, investment, or legal advice, and also does not constitute endorsement of the speakers. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the CFB or its board of directors. Today, right after I do my intro here, Delynn will be kicking off our event, followed by our two speakers. And then after that, we'll be opening the event to a question answer session. If you have any questions during this event, any items that you want to add, you can go ahead and I think either at the top of your screen or at the bottom, if you just hover over it, a little bar is going to pop up. And you can submit your questions to the question and answer portal there, or you can also add it to the chat. With that said, I'll hand this off to Delynn.
Thank you, Faith, very much for that introduction. And I want to start by saying a hello and a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us for this educational webinar today. As the board chair of the Community Foundation of the Verdugos, it is my pleasure to be part of an organization that is so dedicated to strengthening our community. And before we get going with our fabulous presentations today, I wanted to say a few words about the role of the foundation in the community and the work that we do. First, as a foundation, we are really dedicated to understanding, diagnosing and being aware of all the needs that exist in our community. Secondly, we work very closely with our donors to have a thorough understanding of their philanthropic mission and to be sure that that mission is being met through their work at the foundation. We do like to make our donors aware of all the needs that exist in the community to be sure that the causes that are most important to them are receiving their support. And lastly, we do strive to have a role in education, not just for our donors, but also for our nonprofits and members of the community. The purpose of our role in education is to strengthen the community. And as our mission is one of education, we've selected two topics for today, estate planning, as well as a stock market outlook, both of which we feel have taken on greater importance during this pandemic year. And we're very excited to have Vanessa Terzian, a partner at Lagerlof, and Jesse McCombs, a senior portfolio manager with Northern Trust, here with us today. So, as I've mentioned, Vanessa is an estate planning attorney and a partner with Lagerlof in Pasadena. She is also an adjunct professor of wills and trust with Southwestern Law School. Vanessa was named as a top attorney and a rising star by Super Lawyer. And she started her career as a trust officer with Wells Fargo, where she worked with many clients, portfolio managers, and beneficiaries. So through the years, Vanessa has had the opportunity to not only create, but execute on countless numbers of estate plans for individuals and families. And so we're very excited to have her here today. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Dylan, and thank you so much to the Community Foundation of the Verdugos for having me here tonight and recognizing, especially during a pandemic, that a lot of us are concerned about the status of our estate plan. If we have documents in place, should we get them updated? So we want to cover some of that important information tonight. There's a lot to cover and not a ton of time. So if you have any other questions that you'd like to follow up with me, my contact information will be at the end of the webinar and you're welcome to reach out, and then there'll be time for Q&A at the end. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump into the slides. And the idea behind an estate plan, and my trust and wills professor always said, if you don't have an estate plan, the state will have one for you. There's always a default, but ideally we would have the opportunity as individuals to choose what our wishes are. And those documents would be clear ahead of time, providing who we want to take care of such important decisions without court involvement. So my goal, and for many of you here tonight, our goal is to ensure we have a plan in place ahead of time, and it's available for those who need to step in to help us if we're incapacitated or pass away. So there's a few important documents. We'll go on to the next slide and we'll see and we'll talk about some of those that you'd want to think about having if you don't already, or some things to think about and how to update those if you have the existing document. So the one that's probably first and foremost, given what's going on in the world right now, is the healthcare power of attorney. And this document essentially allows us to name a person to act on our behalf when we don't have the ability to speak and advocate for ourselves and make medical decisions that we'd want to have, and as well as our wishes followed. So in this directive, and let me just say at the outset that lawyers are completely annoying. We'll use 5 different words for the same thing, and then we'll use it interchangeably, and we won't be consistent about it. So you might hear healthcare proxy, you might hear advanced healthcare directive, but the concept behind the document is always the same. It's a directive naming a person to make medical decisions for you, as well as giving them some guidance on what type of decisions you want them to make. The other thing I would keep in mind is because in 1996, we passed federally a HIPAA law, that's the Healthcare and Privacy Act law. We'll want to make sure that we also have authorized in those documents the release of medical information to the persons we've named and some loved ones that ideally are available and maybe even close enough to get to the scene if there's an emergency. So I think before the pandemic, I don't think I was as insistent that there be at least one person on a HIPAA authorization that would allow access to medical information that would be local. I think I'm a little bit more cognizant of that now since I've had to utilize these documents, unfortunately, a little bit more. So it doesn't mean necessarily that you want them to make the ultimate decision, but they could be there available rather quickly to then perhaps contact the key person that you'd want to take over at some point when they can make themselves available if they live across the United States. So some practical things to consider. So can they act in a reasonable amount of time? I think we're looking at that. And if you want to name your sister that lives in New York, that's perfectly fine. Consider having a separate HIPAA authorization for that friend or neighbor or another family member that is more local to loop your sister in and ultimately allow her to make those medical decisions in an important event. And then you want to be clear on what your wishes are. And your thoughts around this might change over time. Sometimes when we're younger and we say, okay, if I were in an irreversible coma, do everything to keep me alive. And then maybe if I'm 99, I may not feel that way. So there are other portions of the medical directive that deal with end of life decisions. And that is something that your physician can counsel you on. And they can go through the different options and you can be clear on it. It's always the idea not to burden someone with having to make that decision without knowing really what your wishes would be, to have it in writing so that it's followed. And then unfortunately, sometimes families argue about these decisions, but it's in writing the ideas that would be followed. So you'll see that there's the medical power of attorney and a financial power of attorney that I'll cover in a second. I would say you want to look at these about every 3 to 5 years. So if it's been 10, 15, 20, 30 years since you did your estate plan, dust off those documents, review them. And honestly, if you're not ready to go to an attorney to get these updated, there are statutory forms available online, and most likely your medical provider would have a copy as well too. Okay, and then name an alternate. So the last bullet point on this is think of a primary person and then think of a backup. Okay, so we'll cover now on the next slide the financial power of attorney. And that also sometimes has different names. So you might hear it called durable power of attorney, but it's essentially the legal document that allows someone to step in if you're incapacitated to handle financial decisions. So someone like Jesse or Jalynn who work for a financial institution, they're ideally going to have this document on file for you ahead of time, because then they would know if an emergency occurs, they know who they can talk to and who they have authorization to release information to and take direction from. One of the things that I always say though is not every power of attorney is created equal. What I mean by that is take a look at the document, not only who does it name, because you obviously need to trust that person, but when is it effective? There are 2 types of powers of attorney, one that you would sign, making that authority effective immediately, meaning technically you give that person the ability to access accounts the moment you sign it. Now, presumably they're not going to go do that right away because you're fine and well. The other alternative is take a look at whether your power of attorney is effective only when you become incapacitated. So sometimes a client will say, well, that seems obvious. I want it only when I'm not able to make decisions. And the only downside to that is logistically, these issues sometimes come up in an emergency situation, and there has to be a triggering event to define what incapacity is. And oftentimes that's a doctor's note. So it would take some time to obtain that doctor's note, and capacity sometimes is a gray area. So it may take some time to actually get that confirmed. Just know during that period, your agent would not be able to act for you. So sometimes when it's a married couple and they name their spouse, they're a little bit more comfortable maybe making that document effective immediately. Just understand there is a difference, and you want to know how your agent can act, but not only how, but when, okay? So you're able to customize this document. My powers of attorney, they're long. I'll be honest, it's about 20 pages long, because I always tell my clients it's not because I want to waste paper. It's because I'm affirmatively including all of the powers that I want the agent to act on my behalf, and not only just listing the power, but how can they act on my behalf, or providing some details. But same with the power of attorney for finances, for medical, for the financial one as well. There is a statutory form. So if you're not ready again to see an attorney to draft something more custom for you, you can utilize a statutory form that's available on a website. Typically, California has its own sample form, or you may actually talk to your financial advisor. They might have their own form that's specific to the financial institution. It's probably not going to work for all institutions, but it's something, it's a start. And I would say if you have to prioritize which documents you would start with, it's no coincidence that I'm talking about these documents first, because I think statistically they're the most likely to come up. You know, hopefully none of us on this call today are going to not be here tomorrow, but we might not be available because of an accident or an illness. And these would be the important documents we'd want to focus on first. So we'll go on to the next slide and talk about some of the other documents that are important. So a last will and testament, a lot of us think of that as the primary document to lay out our wishes if something has happened and we've passed away, and how do we want our assets to be distributed, who would be in charge. So the first documents I just talked about are very much important while we're alive, okay? Then the powers of attorney become null and void when you pass away. So every once in a while I'll have someone say, I'm my mom's power of attorney. If she's passed away, no, you're not anymore, okay? At that point, we'd move over to a will, or you'll see in a moment, we'll talk about a trust. So there would be 2 potential documents that would give someone in a will, an executor we call it, to follow what the wishes are of the person who signed the will and settle up the estate, okay? So the reality though, and why most of my clients haven't relied on a will as the center of their estate plan, is in California, a will go through our court process called probate. So it will be what we call lodged or submitted to the court to initiate the estate settlement process through the court system. Should the value of the estate exceed on real estate $50,000, so very low threshold, and on personal property $166,000. So for some people, this works fine if it's a very simple estate, but we'll spend most of our time talking about trust on the next slide, because for most of us, we own real estate. Let's say we own our home, and in Southern California, my guess is it's probably going to be worth more than $50,000. So a will is good because it would be important to lay out what your wish is, but it won't avoid probate, and probate is also expensive. Besides it having to go through our court system and taking a long time, there's a statutory fee based on a 4% the gross estate. So it is expensive. If we own a home worth $1 million, it doesn't matter that I have a mortgage of $700,000 on it. My family's still going to pay a probate fee of about $40,000 to receive my assets through my estate if I just do a will. So we'll spend the most time on the next slide because probably, again, like I said, most of you who have done an estate plan with an attorney probably have a trust as like the main center document that lays out your wishes, who would be in charge, and if it's properly funded, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, it's going to avoid probate. It's a little confusing because if you've done it, your estate plan, you have a will, usually in addition to a trust, but what your will would say if you have a family trust or a revocable trust, it would say basically C trust. It's called a pour over will, so it's just going to support the fact that you want all of your assets to funnel through the terms of this document. And the best way that I've always described a trust to my clients and my colleagues is it's like a big bucket. So you set up your trust bucket, and then you have to work with your financial advisors like Jesse and Dylan to make sure you've connected all of your assets to the trust. Otherwise, you can have stuff floating outside of your bucket that won't work. That'll actually trigger probate potentially. So you're going to push everything through the bucket, and that's what's going to lay out what your wishes are, who would be in charge, and that person is called a trustee. So while you're living, you're your own trustee. But what you're thinking about as you draft your document is who would step in if you're not available because you're incapacitated or pass away to manage the assets that are held inside of your trust. So the trust does address incapacity the same way a power of attorney does. They kind of work together to cover all of the assets to ensure there's clearly a person who's in charge of financial decision making. So you want to think long and hard about who you're going to put as trustee. That is a very difficult decision, and it might change. So what I think is a good message to set across is it's time to look at what you have, who you have, talk to them, make sure they're willing to continue to act in that role. They may be going through something in their life where it makes it probably not possible for them to do it. So talk to them, make sure they know where your documents are, how to find things, who to call. So think about who your trustee, and obviously ideally a backup. You've got to trust the trustee. And there are different options. Jesse works for an institution that actually offers corporate trustee services. I used to work for one. Our firm does it. There are professional fiduciaries that do it. So take a look at who you've named, make sure they're willing to do it. And most often my clients will choose a family member or friend, and that's perfectly fine. But make sure you give that trustee who would step in for you the right tools to do their job. And it's not enough to just say, I wrote a trust and set it and totally forget it. It's about thinking about when we implement these documents, what that's going to look like. So you're the current beneficiary, and you're looking at, do I have family? Do I have friends? Do I have charity like the Community Foundation, the Verdugo's listed as a beneficiary? Who do I want to leave assets to? And again, the last thing I'll leave you with on the trust is take a look at, we all just got our property tax bills. So what you're going to want to see on your property tax bills, if you have a trust, you're going to see the trust name on that. If you just set up a trust, sometimes they're slow at the assessor's office to get it updated, so it might take a couple rounds. But ultimately, every year going forward, check to make sure your property tax bill comes to your trust name. So that's how you know that your house is in the trust. You can go to the financial institution, retitle accounts. The one type of asset that we may get into talking about a little bit under Jesse's presentation is retirement accounts. Those typically are not titled in the trust name, but what you want to do with those is actually ensure that you've put a beneficiary designated on that. Sometimes that's a charity as well too. Sometimes it's the trust, sometimes it's a spouse. There's a lot of actual tax considerations that you'll want to take into consideration when you look at the beneficiary designations, but what you don't want is to have it empty, to have it blank, because that also can trigger probate. So take it one by one, step by step, and make sure every asset is in the trust. Going on to the next slide, and we'll talk about things that might actually change in the life. So we can even advance one more slide and look at some things to take a look at. If I have children, if I did this plan, were they 5 years old when I did it? Have I gone through a different change in life event like a marriage or divorce? Sometimes we're looking at individual beneficiaries. I have a client who I worked with this morning. Her son was perfectly healthy and unfortunately through an illness is now permanently disabled. We need to actually redo her entire plan to have special needs provisions. So there are life things that occur that sometimes get updated in the trust. Moving to another state is another one to think about. So go on to the next slide, and we'll look at, does it still make sense to have the people that I named in the trust? Please make sure they're still living. I know that sounds very obvious, but I've had to deal with estates where everyone named in the trust is no longer. So this was pretty much covered on the last slide. So just in the interest of time, we'll move along. I think that one was covered as well too. Oh, I guess go back. There was one point on that one. And I think on the last slide is additional property. So I think we talked about an inheritance. That would be nice. Make sure that goes into the bucket. I think we covered different life events. I think that would be good to talk to your estate planner about, good to update your estate plan. So thinking about what comes next. So on the final slide, what I'll leave you with is changes in the tax law. So I think the last thing I'll close with in the next minute or so would be, I've received a lot of calls concerned about with a change in administration. Are we going to change estate tax laws? So I'll do two high-level points on tax changes. The first would be estate taxes, and the second would be we received an inquiry about Prop 19. I'll take a minute or two about each of them. And then, like I said, we would almost have to have a whole presentation just on taxes, and that would be really fun, I'm sure, for everyone. But if you have other questions, you can reach out to me directly if you want. So estate taxes. Estate taxes are an inheritance tax that's triggered on death, and it essentially is only triggered currently on a federal level. California does not have inheritance tax at estates at 11.5 or above. This is not going to stay at 11.5. It's a very high number. We've never seen it this high ever. It's in 2026. The year 2026 is the year that the exemption goes back down to what it was before, which would be $5 million, and it'll probably be adjusted for inflation. So maybe 5.5, 6 million. The law could change before then. So there's different proposals to bring it back down to 3.5 million. It's a moving target. You need to watch it to make sure you're working with your planners to ensure that you've maximized that $11 million exclusion. You certainly can include charities if you're above that exclusion in your estate plan, because your estate will get a deduction for gifting to charities, and they will not pay that inheritance tax on any of those gifts. So it's a great way to do some strategic planning if you have a charitable inclination. And finally, Prop 19. So Prop 19 is related to inheritance in an interesting way. It's a proposition that does allow seniors age 55 and over, which I never really thought a senior, but that's the age. They're able to move from one house to another house of greater value or less or equal value, and transfer the same property tax basis, the same low property tax basis that you get to keep under Prop 13. So that's a great benefit for people who need to perhaps downsize, but in today's market, downsizing doesn't really mean the price tag goes down much. And then finally, there is one inheritance tax implication to that rule, which is, or that new law, Prop 19, is that a parent could pass away and leave their child real estate. And under the parent-child exclusion, which is Prop 58, they were able to keep their low property tax basis as well as the parent had. The child could keep that. That is going away, okay? Under Prop 19, it's going away with the exception of if the child's going to live in that house as their residence, then they can keep it and keep the low property taxes, and there's a cap. So it's a nuanced law. Take a look at it and contact me offline if you have any other questions. I am out of time, and we'll have maybe some time in the end for Q&A. I'm going to turn the webinar back over to Delynn, and she's going to introduce our wonderful next speaker, Jessie.
Thank you, Vanessa, so much. And it is my pleasure to introduce Jessie McCombs. She is a senior portfolio manager with Northern Trust. Jessie joined Northern Trust in 2005 and has been designing customized wealth plans for families, individuals, and institutions since 2008. As a senior portfolio manager, it is Jessie's highest objective to thoroughly get to know her clients, to have a really deep understanding of their personal goals, and then work to create a wealth plan that is custom tailored to meet those goals. Jessie holds the Certified Financial Planner designation, as well as a bachelor's degree in business administration with an emphasis in finance. So with that, I will turn it over to Jessie.
Hi, thank you, Delynn. It's an honor to be with everyone this afternoon. 2020 has been an abnormal year in more ways than one. From a market perspective, the typical stock market return during an election year falls somewhere between the two gray lines shown on the slide. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Our trajectory this year, if we follow the light green line, diverged strongly from the median, with much of the US shut down from COVID in the spring. The market rebounded swiftly during the summer months, but volatility picked up again in September ahead of the election. To the next slide, it is natural for investors to look for a connection between who wins the White House and which way stocks will go during their leadership. From a historical perspective, the political party in the White House hasn't had a predictable impact on stock market results. But if we move to the next slide, when we dig deeper, we look to see if data is more conclusive when the president enjoys full congressional support. On average, the market has seen better returns under a Democratic president, 10.5% versus 6.9%. But when a Republican president has full support of Congress, the market has seen its highest returns, 15.7%. With a Democrat in the White House and a split Congress, stock market returns have also fared well at 13.1%. The reality, though, is that none of these combinations have been frequent enough to be statistically reliable. For example, there have only been 7 years where Republicans controlled the White House and Congress. On the next slide, election stock returns. In fact, stocks have trended upward across administrations from both parties. And if we think about it, shareholders are investing in companies, not a political party. And companies focus on serving customers and growing their businesses, regardless of who is in the White House. US presidents may have an impact on market returns, but so do hundreds, if not thousands, of other factors. Actions such as foreign leaders, global pandemics, interest rate changes, rising in oil and falling oil prices, and technological advances, to name a few. The next slide, this year brings a unique risk case, the corona pandemic, which injected fear into the market. But when we look historically, every year presents a different fear for investors. Being invested in the stock market and risk assets in general requires a strong stomach at times. The most important thing right now for investors is to filter out the noise in the media and focus on the long term. Your investment plan should be based on your long-term goals and should only change if you experience a meaningful shift in your asset base or financial goals. It is important now as ever to fight the urge to let your emotions or short-term market volatility drive your investment strategy. On to the next slide. From a political standpoint, the race for Senate majority comes down to two runoff elections in Georgia this January. Democrats would need to win both in order for the Senate to take over Senate control. With all media organizations calling the presidential election for Vice President Joe Biden, we are likely to experience a divided government for the next 2 years. So Biden's proposed policy changes, an increase on taxes for the wealthy, an increase on corporate taxes from 21 to 28%, and a massive fiscal stimulus bill under a divided government are likely off the table. We expect approved fiscal stimulus to be smaller and take longer to put in place. We expect tax increases to be on hold for wealthy individuals and corporations. From a market perspective, this means corporate earnings growth should be stronger, and all else being equal, the markets like this constraint on the government. And we see, when we look throughout history, we see this trend. They call it the Goldilocks scenario. The next slide, from the pandemic perspective, we have seen a worrisome rise in COVID cases around the world, with the US and Europe setting records for new confirmed cases. And South America, North Africa, and India coping with serious outbreaks. While total cases rise, we aren't seeing a commensurate rise in hospitalizations or deaths, which is good news. The mortality rate has been significantly improved by some therapeutics and drugs such as dexamethasone and remdesivir, which have increased the survival rate in recent months. While there will likely be a targeted measure to dial down socialization regionally, we do not expect to see a broad lockdown to the degree we saw in the spring going forward. Recent news, on Monday, Pfizer announced that early data showed its vaccine prevented COVID in more than 90% of volunteers, a much more promising efficacy level than expected. And Moderna and Novavax have also reported encouraging news about their vaccines. Pfizer estimates that by the end of the year, it will have manufactured enough doses to immunize up to 20 million people. We believe an effective vaccine will be widely available by mid-2021. The next slide. Our base case for the market is for positive but slow economic outlook, very low interest rates to persist through the first half of the decade, and low inflation expectations. Low for long interest rates will support current higher equity valuations. We recommend investors stay the course and stick to their plan during what could be a prolonged period of uncertainty. In the coming weeks and months, we will know more about what our government will look like in 2021. We will have a much better idea and data on vaccines and when and how they will be distributed. And our economic output will look significantly better as more people are able to return back to work. And as an investor, sometimes the hardest thing to do is to not react or make changes based on volatility or uncertainty and fear. Now I want to move to the importance of asset allocation and picking the right investment mix. It is necessary today more than ever to be thoughtful about your investment mix, as expected returns going forward are lower than historically seen. In 2000, an investor with 100% investment grade bond portfolio could see a return of 6.5% with total risks of only 3.7%. I think those were the good days. During the financial crisis, interest rates were lowered and the typical investor was forced to look at risk assets or stocks to generate moderate total return. For example, in 2010, as the slide illustrates, the same investor would need to add 75% in US stocks in order to see the same 6.5% return, but with a much higher risk of 12.2%. And currently, with rates still low and not rising anytime soon, and risk assets expected to generate returns in the low, mid-single digits, the same investor would need to assemble an assortment of risk assets to come up with the same 6.5% return, but with an even higher expected risk of 14.2%. So why invest at all, you might be thinking? With investors living much longer post-retirement, most investors need some level of growth in excess of inflation, fees, and taxes to support their lifestyle over time and satisfy their financial goals. If we switch to the next slide, the level of growth is directly determined by your level of portfolio risk. There are no free lunches. The right level of risk is unique to every investor. We determine this by using a combination of factors such as asset level, timing, amount of financial goals, and risk tolerance. In determining risk tolerance, it is good to look at the variation of returns. This slide, albeit a little busy, shows portfolios of various asset mixes annually from 1950 to 2020. And if we look at 100% stock portfolio, which is the top row at the top of the slide, this portfolio has seen market swings on any given year up to 61% positive in 1 year and 43% negative. So a huge swing year over year over the last 70 years. A 100% bond portfolio at the very bottom of the slide has seen market swings of 28% positive, but only 3% negative. So this slide illustrates that on any given year, the level of stocks you own directly relates to the level of volatility you could experience. If we move to the next slide, this is the same slide, but shows 10-year returns during the same time period. So while 1 year returns were extremely volatile in portfolios with higher stock exposure, the 10-year return shows a much clearer picture. If an investor is able to withstand the volatility swings of individual years, a level of stock exposure over the long term has been shown to be beneficial. Moving on, and as painful as negative market returns feel, this in fact has only happened 25 times in nearly 100 years. Over this time period, the compound annual growth rate is 10.2% per year, a great reason to stay invested. The next slide. We know that corrections in the market defined as a 10 to 19% decline occur on average 5.75 years. And bear markets defined as a 20% or greater decline occur on average every 6.7 years. Because we know downturns happen from time to time, we do a lot of scenario planning to ensure clients can survive any risk scenario. A client with a huge balance sheet might have the ability to survive any economic event and can afford to invest more aggressively. If an investor's balance sheet is more modest, they may have constraints around how they should invest. For example, in February, we started to see drops in the stock market due to COVID fear because we had a plan in place for every client portfolio called a portfolio reserve or safety net Our clients were able to stay put and not panic into selling during a downturn. Each investor should have a plan in place to withstand pressure of selling at inopportune times. Next slide. A sophisticated investment mix takes into account the amount and, most importantly, the timing of your financial goals. The amount of risk control assets or safe bonds and cash should be aligned to cover your near-term financial goals plus your safety net. And the amount of risk assets or goals and other growth assets should be aligned to support your long-term financial goals. And to the last slide, when we are able to match your assets to your goals, we can answer important questions so you can take actionable steps. So one question I get a lot is, can I retire tomorrow, or do I need to work another 10 years? That's an important one for my clients. Another question is, can I afford to do sophisticated estate planning techniques to minimize my potential future estate tax? An important question. Also important to know whether you have sufficient assets to make those planning goals. And 3, can I afford to give an aspirational philanthropic gift during my lifetime? I have a wonderful client who lost her husband a couple years ago. Her husband was a Stanford alum, and she was very interested in leaving a gift to his alma mater to honor him. And she was thinking about adding to her estate plan at her death a $1 million gift to Stanford. And through the analysis, we were able to show her that not only does she have enough asset base to do that, but she could actually do that during her lifetime. And she could experience the joy of giving that gift during her lifetime because she had the assets to support it, in addition to the goals for the rest of her lifetime. And with that, I will turn it back to Faith for Q&A.
Thank you. Really great, Jessie. Thank you so much. So at this time, we are taking questions and questions from everyone. We don't have any questions in the queue right now. So if you have a question, go ahead and you can add it to the chat and or to the question answer area. And you could be the first. And again, we'll have this video, it will be recorded. So if anyone wants to review the information back again, it will be available on both YouTube and on Facebook. And we'll have that recorded and available to everyone. We have both Jessie's information and Vanessa's information on in these slides. And I'm going to go ahead and fast forward back through them because it looked like my computer kind of exited out of some of these slides here. So we'll zoom forward over to Jessie's. Jessie's information was on the earlier slide. Thank you. All right, well, at this time, I think we're going to conclude. There are no questions at the moment, but again, if anyone does have any, feel free to reach out to the Community Foundation, the Verdugos, Jessie, or Vanessa. And with that, I'll hand this back over to Dylan.
Thank you.
Dylan, could I say something really fast?
Yes, go ahead, Vanessa.
You have a couple of minutes. I wanted to use Jessie's last example of her client who was able to give during her lifetime. And I think another way to look at that is sometimes, I always call it giving with a warm hand. It's kind of a nice way to think about it. She got to enjoy seeing those funds in use. So one of the things that I'm finding is, as all of us know, qualified money that comes from our retirement account, is subject to ordinary income tax when we pull it out. And it's also just subject to income tax when we leave this asset to our children or our spouse when they pull it out, right? So it doesn't pass to them, unlike other assets, tax-free in that regard. So the fact is that you can utilize not only the beneficiary designation to leave those funds at death, but you can and give that to a charity and they take that income tax-free. And sometimes I find that the children or the family, they don't want it. They're already paying enough taxes. So it's a nice way to tax efficiently utilize those funds so the dollars are stretched a lot more when it goes to a charity. But you also can do that during your lifetime with your required minimum distributions. So I might say, I have to take this money out of my retirement account. And with the Secure Act, we now know that we can start doing that at 73. We also know that inherited IRAs have to be pulled out in 10 years. No longer can kids or other beneficiaries besides a spouse stretch it out over their lifetime. So they're gonna have to take it all out at 10 years. So another way to give to a charity if you want is to take the RMDs and shoot that over to a charity directly. You'll get a charitable deduction and you won't obviously pay income tax on the amount that you donated for that year. So there's just so many different ways you can talk to your advisor about, of course, giving through your estate plan, which is what I tend to focus on, but also giving while living. Okay. So I have 2 questions that came through. I think both of them are directed to me, so I'm going to cover those. We have about 15 minutes, so I'll take maybe couple minutes each and not rush through as much as I thought I'd have to. So these are great questions. So the first is commenting on the fact that powers of attorney seem to be so behind much of the elder financial abuse. And I think that's a really great observation. So I believe what that question is looking at is, you can download a power of attorney offline. I mentioned and said, if you're not ready to see an attorney, one way to get something done is utilizing the statutory power of attorney. But the downside is, well, anyone can do it. Anyone can download this legal document, get it signed in front of a notary. There's not a huge threshold or barrier to entry there. And then we worry about, well, did a nefarious caregiver do that? Did someone who's not going to look out for the best interest of the person, the principal, we call it? And I think we really are behind the times to this comment in passing legislation to protect elderly, seniors, those of older ages from getting talked into signing some legal document that immediately gives someone the right to sell their house, deed away their house, take a reverse mortgage on the house or other loan that they wouldn't be aware of. And without having an advocate like an attorney perhaps, or even a family member or friend that's close by that can check in and say, catch some of these issues, we have a problem. What I think is happening though is some financial institutions are on the lookout for signs of elder financial abuse. The reality is most perpetrators, sadly to say, are relatives and family members. So we can be on the lookout for that for our clients. I think banks and financial institutions are pushing back on powers of attorney when they're what we call stale, they're several years old. Unfortunately, sometimes that works against us. When there's a valid power of attorney, we're not able to utilize as easily as we want to. So I think there needs to be better oversight to statutory powers of attorney and how they need to be executed. We do require notarization or witnesses, but unfortunately, that's just not enough, I think, to prevent financial elder abuse. So be on the lookout for that for your parents, your loved ones, your friends, because it is rampant, and I don't think we have enough oversight to protect that. But hopefully, other advisors and financial institutions are on the lookout and on it a little bit more. Proposition 19. So we have a little bit of time now because I ran right through it. So it did 2 things basically. Proposition 19 is related to property taxes. So it's confusing because we've always had Proposition 13 that was passed years ago that said, okay, our property tax can only go up a little bit. And unlike other states that keep up with the value of the house, Proposition 13 will artificially keep the property tax basis. And that's a different basis than cost basis. It'll keep your property tax basis low. And much lower than fair market value. So you look at your property tax bill, you look at assessed value, and you'll see, oh, my $1 million home is assessed at $500,000. That's mean I'm paying roughly 1% a year on that $500,000. The good thing about Proposition 19 is allows someone over the age of 55 to sell their personal residence and transfer their property tax basis. Again, property tax basis over to their new home. And it expanded. This was allowed before, but it was only allowed where the county voted each year to decide whether their county would allow for this. So you had to find a reciprocal county to move to if you wanted to make sure Ventura County was allowing for it, and that could change year by year. So it expands that. And the hard part was always you had to find a replacement property. Your new residence had to be of equal or lesser value. And given current values in Southern California, it was really hard to do. So now you don't have to worry about that. So that helps. If someone needs to downsize, like I said, they might be downsizing the structure and size of the house, but the price might be the same. The price point might be the same. So they, before Prop 19 would run into issues with that, they are not going to anymore. However, at the same time, Proposition 19 also took away most of what Prop 58 used to allow, which was exclusion from the transfer of reassessment. Property taxes used to be able to stay at the same low assessed value between parent and child. And you used to be able to do that with your house no matter how much. You could have a $10 million home, you could transfer it to your kids, and no matter what they used it for, vacation home, investment homes, they could keep the low property tax basis. You also had another $1 million per person of assessed value being transferred. So you could take your residence, give it to the kids, no reassessment. You could take a rental property vacation home that's assessed at $500,000, even though it's valued at $1 million. Give this to your kids when you passed away, and the same thing, low property tax basis. Under Prop 19, kids will only get to keep the low property taxes if they continue to live in the house as their residence. And like I said, there is a limit to the value that they can, so the house can only exceed a certain amount. And I can't quote it right now because I haven't read through the whole entire proposition yet, but it'll be limited to even the value of that particular home. So it takes Prop 58 and really limits that parent-child exclusion, which means I've already probably got, I think I mentioned this week, about half a dozen calls about, should I transfer, that basis now to my kids? And that is definitely on a case-by-case basis, not anything we'd go into today, but it is something you'd want to talk to a tax advisor or attorney about before you do.
All right.
Go ahead.
I have a question here. Somebody asked if I had any thoughts about the Biden proposal of a step up in basis elimination. And I would say with a divided government, those types of progressive policy changes are probably off the table. And even in January, if the Democrats pick up both seats, I don't think that they're going to have enough of a cushion in the Senate to be able to pass such progressive changes. So I think that's probably unlikely at this point, but that's a really good question. And I would add too that, we do work with our clients' trust and estate planning attorneys a lot. We work hand in hand to, as I mentioned, develop that analysis to determine the asset sufficiency or the amount of assets that exceed a client's lifetime of financial goals. And just like with that client who wanted to make that aspirational philanthropic gift, that sufficiency is then used as the sand in the sandbox to determine the amount in which can be used from a planning perspective. So our kind of what we do for clients really goes side by side in order to help clients understand the level of wealth that they have in excess of their lifetime of goals and how they should plan to limit their future estate tax.
Great, thank you, Jessie. We have one final question here. When does Prop 19 go into effect?
I was just putting that in the chat box, that as I'm reading the proposed legislation, I see a deadline of February 16th, 2021.
Great, thank you. All right, well, that concludes our question and answer portion. And again, we'll swing this back to Dylan. Thank you, Vanessa and Jesse.
Thank you, Vanessa and Jesse, so much for the time and for the presentations. And I wanted to also thank all the participants for joining us today. If anyone has an educational topic that they'd like to learn more about, or if you'd like to learn more about Community Foundation of the Verdugos, please visit us at cfverdugos.org or go ahead and make a call to the foundation. We'd be happy to talk with you. So thank you again for your time, and thank you to the speakers.
Thank you. Have a great one, everyone.
Thanks, Faith.
We'll see you next time. Bye.